So what I'd like to talk about in this video is something that very few people know about the Bible, regardless of whether they're a critic, a skeptic, a non-believer, or whether they're a devout believer in the contents of the Bible. It's not just a tangential thing or a peripheral thing. It's a very fundamental aspect of these books and how they work. And that's the idea of structure or the shape of the books. Now, if I were to talk about the Parthenon in Athens, all of us know it's basically a rectangular box, and it's surrounded by pillars. It creates colonnades, and it's got a peaked roof, and then there's these very famous pediments on the front and back of the building. And the sculptures on these pediments are all about Athena. She's at the center of these two constellations of sculptures. There's also four sides, what are called metopes, up at the top that run along the sort of roof line all around on all four sides, and those depict four different battles between civilized or at least superior armies and uncivilized, barbaric, inferior armies. And in all four cases, historically, or at least according to the records, the civilized armies won. So that's just the basic shape or structure of the building. If someone came along who was a critic and said, yeah, I don't buy that. It's really a sphere, or it's a globe, or it's a giant circle or something, most of us would just think this is ridiculous. It has its shape, and it's not for us to come along and try and say it doesn't have that shape. You just have to observe what the shape is. So when it comes to a book, books have shape and structure as well. But as in a building, they only have the amount of order, structure, and shape that the original designer of the book decided to give it. So we can't add more structure and shape than's already there, but nor do we want to assume there's less structure and shape and order to the book than there really is. So what we're going to do is we're just going to look at the actual words of John in order, not the whole book, just certain verses in the book, with as minimal an interpretation layer as I can give them. So I don't want you to come away thinking this is my own subjective analysis, but rather for you to see John the way we look at the Parthenon, that it has a very clear structure and shape, and it's there for anyone to see it. And then to help to know, by knowing that, is sort of like a foundational layer. It's a fundamental layer to then understanding sort of the significance of the book. And if you don't know the structure and shape of it, you're missing some really big aspects of how to interpret the various parts of the book. So let's look at chapter 2 and verse 13. We're going to jump a little bit into the middle. We'll come back here later, but you'll see why. Chapter 2 and verse 13, it says that the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So this was a festival. Verse 13 says that at the festival, Jesus went to Jerusalem. He had been in Galilee, and now he was traveling up to Jerusalem. And a number of events happened at the festival. And on the route back through Samaria to Galilee. So he starts in Galilee, he goes to the festival, and then he travels back. And all the events in these chapters are concerning that particular visit for the festival. Chapter 5 and verse 1 says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And you have another festival. Jesus leaves Galilee and goes up to the feast. The events in chapter 5 happen in Jerusalem, and then in chapter 6, he's back in Galilee. And that chapter ends in Galilee. So that's the end of that section. And then in chapter 7, in the opening verses of that chapter, the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So Jesus went up. First his brothers went up, and then he went up following them. So again, that's the opening verses of chapter 7. And it follows the same pattern. He goes from Galilee up to Jerusalem for the occasion of the holiday. Events ensue while at the festival, and he appears to have stayed over, or at least stayed in Judea, for the festival of the dedication, which is shortly after in the calendar year. At the end of chapter 10, he's at the feast of the dedication, and then that section ends. And then chapters 11, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up And then in chapter 12, this little line, Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. And this introduction is a little longer. You can see it's a much larger section, chapters 11 to 20. And the opening story is about Lazarus. But Lazarus, his resurrection is what creates a massive amount of publicity, so that as Jesus arrives for the Passover, the crowds come out to greet him on Palm Sunday. And in chapter 12, John tells us expressly that it's because of the witness to Lazarus' resurrection that the crowds were stirred up and came out to meet Jesus for this, what ends up being the final visit for a holiday in the book of John. And that goes all the way to chapter 20, where he, of course, is arrested, tried, convicted, crucified, and then raised from the dead. And at the end of this section here in chapter 20, you have a comment from the author, really two comments, about why he has written the book. We'll talk about that in just a little bit here. So it's not surprising anyway that that's where you get a comment. Classical authors frequently told us why they wrote the book, either in the opening or in the closing of the book. And you can see that you have some content before, what people call the prologue or the introduction. There is no feast during these first chapter and a half, and then the epilogue in chapter 21. And again, there is no feast. So the Gospel of John appears, anyway, at first reading here, to be a book divided into six sections, an introduction and a conclusion, plus 4 stories of the record of Jesus' visit to the city of Jerusalem on the occasion of various Jewish holidays. So seems anyway to be the structure and shape of the book. Now those are the opening verses of each of the 6 sections. Let's now go and look at the final verses, the closing verses of each of these sections. Chapter 2 and verse 11. Jesus did the first of his signs, and his disciples believed. Chapter 4 and verse 52 or so, something like that. The official whose son had been healed, says the official believed. And this was now the second sign that Jesus had done. And then in chapter 6 and around verse 68, again, I can't remember the exact verses, somewhere around the end here, we believe, says Simon Peter, and know that you are the Holy One of God. So the first half of the book, 3 sections, all ending with a statement in the closing verses about somebody who has come, or a group who has come to believe, usually connected to the signs that Jesus did. Then we go to the second half of the book. And in the second half, it says John did no sign. John the Baptizer did no sign. But everything that he said about this man was true. And many believed. But notice now they're believing not because of signs, but because of truth. Their faith is a response to what they judge to be true about Jesus that John the Baptizer had said before Jesus' ministry began. And then at the end of chapter 20, again, this was like 41 or so. Here is chapters, there's a verse in chapter 19, around verse 35. Sorry, I don't remember the exact verses. And then 20, around verse 30. These 2 comments here where the author is talking, reflecting on himself. And he says the author's testimony, who has just witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus, he says his testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth so that you may believe. And again, I already quoted to you, or I referenced anyway, that at the end of chapter 20, there's the statement of why the author wrote the book, that these signs were written so you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, and in believing you may have life in his name, or the Christ, the Son of God, and that in believing you may have life in his name. And then in chapter 21 and verse 24, I think it is, we know, or rather, this is the disciple who wrote these things. Again, another comment, the 3rd one in the book, about the author's writing. We know that his testimony is true. So that as you get to the second half of the book, you see the pattern there, that the final verses of each of these three sections closes with something not all only about coming to believe, people who come to believe in Jesus, but that the basis of their belief is the truth and the signs. All right? Now, let's do, so that, my point is here, you can see the opening verses and now the closing verses leave the very distinct impression of a pattern that is deliberate, that had to have been created by the author who laid out the design, the shape, the structure of the book. But let's do one more thing, just to see if we can confirm it another way. And what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the first half of the book, right up to there. Right? Here's our three sections. Okay? Here, here, and here. So this is chapter 6, the end of the first half of the book. And in chapter 6, we have the story of the feeding of the 5,000, followed by Jesus walking on water, and then preaching the sermon on the bread of life. And you can see that this is a story at the Sea of Galilee. At the Sea of Galilee. Now, why is that important? Because this is the very first story in the book at the Sea of Galilee. It doesn't occur until the final episodes of the first half of the book. There's no other story that takes place at the Sea of Galilee. And at the Sea of Galilee, it says he distributed the bread and the fish, because this is a public supernatural meal provided to the crowds, also involving the disciples. And at the end of that occasion, the 2 days that it records this event at the Sea of Galilee, Jesus has a conversation, and Simon Peter responds to him at the very end of that chapter. All right? Now we look at the end of the second half of the book. Now, some scholars insist that chapter 21 is not original to the Gospel of John, but it is in all the manuscripts. So let's look at what's there. Well, it turns out that this final event is also at the Sea of Galilee. And this is now the second time that we have an event at the Sea of Galilee. There are only 2 stories in the whole Gospel of John that take place at the Sea of Galilee. One in chapter 6, one in chapter 21. And what happened in 21 is Jesus told the disciples, when he was standing on the shore, they didn't know it was him. This is post-resurrection Jesus. They can't see him. He's at a distance from the sea, from where they are on their boat, and they're fishing. And he says to cast their nets on the other side, and they cast the nets, and they haul this huge draught of fish, and they come to the shore, and then they drag the fish to shore. But as they get there, they see, before they even get the fish out, that Jesus has fish laid out and bread. He has provided a meal of bread and fish for them. But now it's not a public meal, it's a private meal, and it's not been supernaturally provided, or at least there's no indication that Jesus just invented or created rather the fish and bread right there, as he does in chapter 6. At least there's nothing to suggest that. And then it says that he had a conversation with Simon Peter. Do you love me more than these? So you can see that chapters 6 and chapter 21, the 2 ends of the 2 halves of the book, are 2 accounts of events at the Sea of Galilee that are very similar, even though there are some very important differences. So this provides us with now a third crucial pattern. It appears anyway to confirm that our seeing this book as 6 major parts, mainly focused on the major visits Jesus made to Jerusalem for the occasion of holidays, for worship and so on, that we had the first verses of each section here, and then we had the final verses of each of the section here. That created a very distinct pattern. I have hardly interpreted anything. I just simply read these verses to you and have put some color to words. And then you can see also here, where we have the final stories of each of the 2 halves of the book, judging from this layout up here, that there's another pattern that seems too deliberate, to have just been coincidental. So the point of all this is to say that there really does seem to be an obvious shape or structure to the Gospel of John given to us by the designer of the book, the composer of the book. So what's the point of this structure? Is it just to have some nice patterns that give shape to the book, or is there some practical function? If there's no functionality in the way the book is shaped or structured, then it's not going to be very important to us. And of course, the main way to look at a book is in terms of its thought flow. That's the main focus we should always give to the book. The structure is just scaffolding. It's just sort of like a hanger on which you put the clothes. So it's not the thing, but it is meant to support what the main focus of the message of the book is. So in this case, what's the function of all these accounts being shaped around these festivals? Well, in order to arrive at some explanation for that, we have to look at the final verse in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, not the final verse of the book, but what many regard as the author explaining to us what the main purpose of the book is. John the Apostle, I did another video you can look at ipub.org for why I think John is most likely the author of the book, the Apostle. But either way, the author says, "These signs are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So it's clear this is stating why the book was written. And you can see that it says that you may believe here, which explains why each of these major sections end with comments about believing and what leads to belief. Signs. Do signs lead to belief? Yes. And then also truth. Truth leads to belief. So that's the purpose of the book. But the purpose, as you can see right in that statement, is not really belief. That's not the main goal. The main goal is that by believing, you may have life in his name. The goal of the book is life, right? And in this case, of course, it means life with God. Life in the name of Jesus is eternal life, a life that will extend well beyond the life we have physically or the life in this world. So what do all these festivals have to do with life? Well, in the Jewish history, the historical records, or rather the records, I should say, of the early feasts, we discover that these festivals are based on actual events. And the events were events where God delivered Israel, delivered them from their sin, delivered them from their enemies, delivered them from death, and so on. They're all about deliverance from death unto life. And they're memorial festivals, so that when your children in time to come, as it says, say, of the Passover, back in Exodus, your child is going to ask you one day, why are we doing this feast? What's the point of this festival? And then you explain to them the meaning, how God delivered them. They had once been enslaved to Pharaoh, and that they themselves were sinful and needed to have a sacrificial lamb and so on. So you could explain the meaning of what God had done. And all this was to take place before the Lord. So the first command in the Ten Commandments is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and so on, and to have no other gods before you. So everything the congregation was to be brought before the Lord and to be reminded of your relationship with the Lord, because that's what life is actually about. In other words, the holidays were where you push the pause button on life, on the busyness of life, on the work of life, and you congregate with the nation, and you remind yourselves what life is ultimately about. What does it mean? Where does it come from? What is its goal? So the festivals were a great place, a great setting for Jesus to explain the life that he had come to bring. because that's ultimately what the festivals were about. So that at least is one way to look at the relationship between the festivals and the very concept of life as the goal of the book. Now, if I could, just in closing, talk to the people who are really familiar with the content of John, whether they're a pastor, a Bible teacher, a scholar, a critical scholar, a non-believing scholar, or anyone who's quite familiar with John, particularly with the literature, the scholarly research on John, is you're going to say, I mean, if this is all so clear, why isn't this found anywhere? Where is this structure, this shape of the book in the commentaries? And the simple answer is you're not really going to find it in the commentaries. So my first response to that is, well, all that really matters is it convincing? Do you think this is more convincing than the other ways that the book is structured or outlined? And if this seems more convincing, then at least work provisionally with this one. So the first thing is it more convincing? Just what are the arguments? There's a considerable amount of things here working with the opening verses and then the closing verses of each of these sections, and then, of course, the end of the first half of the book, the end of the second half of the book. But we're going to see in the next video I'm going to look at just one of these sections, the introduction, the prologue, to try and show internally what's going on in that section. And of course, as you do that with each one of these, you begin to feel more and more confident that so long as these are unified sections, each one creating its own cohesive unity, as long as they work out that way, then that gives you more confidence that the whole thing is in fact structured this way. So you'll have to wait for a next video in that sense. But again, the more things that bisect, the more unique content that coheres in a way that's patterned, then the more likely it is that this is in fact the original author's design and shape and structure given to the book. The second thing I'd say is that this isn't my structure. It's not just my pet thing. I first heard of the idea of this way of dividing the book, at least in terms of the 6 sections based on the festivals, I heard from the classical scholar David Gooding. So it's not just my own invention. Secondly, though there's a bunch of information I've added in here that I did not hear from David Gooding, I have no idea. I've not seen anything from him of some of these extra things, like how each of the chapters end and how the first and second half end and things. So I can't speak for that, but those are just ways that I've tried to look at to see if there's confirmation for this structure beyond just the opening verses of each of the sections. Then you have H.D.F. Kitto, who was hugely influential for me when I was studying in classics. H.D.F. Kitto had a similar approach that we really only have the material selected by the author and its arrangement, its structure, its disposition in determining meaning. At least those are the priority things to start with. We can then, of course, move on to history and theology and other things, but that's sort of the clay put on the wheel. And then, of course, Robert Alter, the great scholar from Cal Berkeley on the Hebrew side, who did a good bit of showing us patterns in the way the Hebrew literature works in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh. So it's not as though these ideas are completely foreign. Meir Sternberg also showed some parallelism and other things like this. Now, I will say, I've seen a lot of people, as scholars and pastors will know, there is scholarship that tries to look for patterns and chiasms and all sorts of things. And I have to say that I would agree with anyone who says most of the time, the vast majority of the time, it's too clever by a half. It's not that convincing. It's not that clear as the authors, the scholars, the researchers seem to think it is. And they often aren't that functional anyway, or the functionality of it seems a bit arbitrary to me. So as a general rule, I'm actually not very sympathetic to most of the other things I see that are like this structure. So I'm sympathetic, but then I would also say I think here, in this case, the structure is actually pretty well validated by the internal content. And then again, the final thing, it has to be functional. It has to work toward whatever the obvious goals are of the book. In this case, we have a stated goal, life. And maybe the way I propose that these festivals relate to the idea of life. Maybe you think there's a better way to connect those two ideas than I suggested, and that's totally fine. That was my analysis of how to try and see the relationship between the two things, the goal of the book and then the way the book takes its shape. But you might find something better. By all means, put it in the comments section. You might help me arrive at something that's clearer as to what the author was really up to. So this is the first video anyway on John's structure, his shape. Again, the Parthenon in Athens, it has structure and shape. It has pattern and symmetry. And this is hardly foreign to the classical world, both in its architecture as well as in its literature. And it's not surprising that you would see or find at least some of it in the biblical texts, which were composed. So this particular text was composed in the classical world. And so it's not really surprising that you would find some things like this in literary form. It's a similar kind of aesthetic. And again, just as it helps us to focus on the Parthenon, like how Athena is on the two ends, the two pediment ends, and you can ask yourself how the two stories about her relate to the building and the particular stories the designers of the building chose, and then what the metopes have to do symbolically with the story of Athena. These are all, or the city of Athens, these are all really good questions, but they come out of the basic shape and structure of the building. So in the same way, we're trying to do a similar kind of thing with something like a gospel, and that we can only work with the structure that's given to us. Whatever. In this case, it seems to me the structure is very clean and well-ordered and not really that difficult to see, and then to start beginning to ask how these ideas all cohere and relate to one another is the next logical step. What's the functionality?